In the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan, where death whispers through every shadow and survival depends on split-second decisions, Staff Sergeant Maria Santos carried a secret that would save dozens of lives. While her male teammates saw only a quiet communications specialist who rarely spoke during briefings, enemy forces were about to discover why the most dangerous predators are often the ones that hunt in silence. What her own unit didn't know was that Maria had grown up with a rifle in her hands, learning to hunt from her grandfather in the remote hills of Montana, where missing your target meant your family went hungry. What the Taliban fighters positioning themselves for an ambush couldn't have imagined was that the woman they dismissed as just another American soldier had already spotted each of their carefully concealed positions through her scope and was calculating wind speed, distance, and the precise timing needed to turn their planned massacre into their final mistake. This is the true story of how 7 enemy sharpshooters learned too late that the most lethal weapon on the battlefield wasn't the one they could see coming. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos adjusted her radio equipment for the 3rd time that morning, her fingers working automatically while her eyes scanned the rocky terrain ahead. The September sun beat down mercilessly on the Afghan mountainside, and sweat trickled down her back despite the early hour. Around her, the 12-man reconnaissance team moved with practiced efficiency, each soldier focused on their assigned role in what was supposed to be a routine patrol through the Korengal Valley. Team leader Captain Jake Morrison checked his GPS coordinates one more time before signaling the squad to continue their advance toward the suspected Taliban supply cache. His weathered face showed the strain of 3 tours in Afghanistan, and his instincts had kept his men alive through countless missions in this hostile territory. Behind him, Corporal Davis carried the heavy machine gun, its weight distributed across his broad shoulders, while Sergeant Williams maintained point position, his eyes constantly moving across the landscape for any sign of danger. Maria walked near the center of the formation, her role as communications specialist keeping her close to the captain while maintaining radio contact with base camp 15 kilometers away. Most of her teammates had grown accustomed to her quiet presence over the past 8 months. She rarely joined their conversations during downtime, preferring to read or write letters home to her family in Montana. When she did speak, her words were measured and professional, focused entirely on mission requirements and tactical updates. What none of them knew was that Maria had been raised on a remote ranch where the nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away, and where her survival often depended on her ability to put meat on the table. Her grandfather, a Korean War veteran named Joseph Standing Bear, had taught her to shoot when she was barely tall enough to hold a rifle steady. He had shown her how to read wind patterns by watching grass bend, how to calculate distance by studying shadows, and, most importantly, how to remain perfectly still for hours while waiting for the perfect shot. The military had recognized her exceptional marksmanship during basic training, but Maria had deliberately downplayed her abilities when recruiters suggested sniper school. She had joined the army to serve her country and gain technical skills, not to become a killer. The communications specialist position allowed her to contribute meaningfully while staying connected to the family members she called every Sunday when satellite coverage permitted. Captain Morrison raised his fist, bringing the patrol to an immediate halt. His radio crackled with an urgent message from aerial reconnaissance, indicating suspicious movement in the hills surrounding their planned route. The drone footage showed what appeared to be several individuals taking concealed positions at strategic points overlooking the valley floor. Intelligence suggested they were walking into a carefully planned ambush designed to eliminate the entire American patrol. The team quickly established a defensive perimeter behind a cluster of large boulders, their weapons trained on the suspected enemy positions. Captain Morrison studied his tactical map while coordinating with headquarters about possible extraction or reinforcement options. The nearest backup was 40 minutes away, and the terrain made helicopter support extremely dangerous in the current weather conditions. Through her scope, Maria could see movement that her teammates had missed entirely. Her grandfather had taught her that successful hunting required patience above all else, and the ability to distinguish between natural movement and deliberate concealment. What looked like random shadows and Rock formations to most observers revealed themselves as carefully camouflaged positions when examined with the trained eye of someone who had spent countless hours tracking elk through similar mountain terrain. 7 distinct positions became clear to her as she systematically scanned the hillside. Each enemy fighter had chosen their location based on overlapping fields of fire that would create a deadly crossfire once the American patrol moved into the kill zone. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves with military precision, suggesting they were experienced combatants rather than local insurgents with minimal training. Maria keyed her radio to report the enemy positions to Captain Morrison, but before she could speak, automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple directions. Bullets sparked off the rocks around them, and the distinctive crack of sniper rounds echoed through the valley as the ambush began in earnest. Her teammates immediately returned fire, but their shots were poorly aimed due to the difficulty of identifying specific targets among the rocky terrain. Corporal Rodriguez, the team's designated marksman, struggled to engage targets that kept disappearing behind cover after each shot. His training had prepared him for conventional combat situations, but the enemy fighters were using terrain and concealment with expert skill. Each time he thought he had identified a position, the sniper would relocate before he could line up an effective shot. The radio chattered with reports from other units in the area, indicating this was part of a coordinated attack designed to draw American forces into multiple ambushes throughout the valley. Extraction would be impossible until the immediate threat was neutralized, and ammunition supplies would become critical if the engagement continued much longer. Maria watched through her scope as one of the enemy snipers shifted position, moving from behind a large rock to a concealed spot 30 meters to the east. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that the best hunters were those who could predict their prey's next move based on understanding their behavior patterns. These Taliban fighters were following predictable tactics, moving in ways that made sense from a military perspective, but were telegraphed to someone who understood how predators think. Captain Morrison shouted orders to his men, trying to coordinate suppressive fire that would allow them to maneuver to better positions. The enemy had chosen their ambush site perfectly, with clear sight lines and multiple escape routes that made direct assault extremely costly. Without air support or reinforcements, the American team would need to rely entirely on their training and tactical skills to survive the next few hours. The heat was becoming unbearable, and several team members were already showing signs of dehydration. Water supplies that had seemed adequate for a routine patrol would not last through an extended firefight, especially with the stress of combat increasing their physical demands. Medical supplies were limited to basic field dressings, and the nearest combat hospital was over an hour away, even under ideal conditions. Maria made a decision that would change everything. She had spent 8 months watching her teammates risk their lives while she maintained what she considered a support role, but the current situation demanded action that went beyond her assigned duties. Her grandfather had always taught her that true strength came not from avoiding responsibility, but from stepping forward when others needed help the most. She quietly began adjusting her rifle scope, making calculations that had become second nature during countless hunting trips in similar terrain. Wind speed was approximately 8 kilometers per hour from the southwest. Temperature was affecting bullet trajectory, and the distance to the nearest target was roughly 400 meters. These were all factors she had learned to account for automatically, the same way her teammates could field strip their weapons in complete darkness. The first enemy sniper had returned to his original position, confident that the Americans could not effectively engage targets at this range with their standard equipment. His mistake was assuming that all American soldiers were limited by their official roles and standard-issue weapons. Maria had spent her own money to upgrade her rifle scope and had practiced extensively at ranges that exceeded military requirements for communication specialists. Through her crosshairs, she could see the Taliban fighter's profile as he lined up his own shot, probably targeting Captain Morrison or one of the other leaders. The distance required her to aim slightly above and to the left of her actual target, compensating for bullet drop and wind drift that would affect the projectile during its flight time of just over 1 second. Maria controlled her breathing exactly as her grandfather had taught her, slowing her heart rate and eliminating any muscle tension that might affect her aim. The world narrowed to just her rifle, and the target that threatened her teammates' lives. Everything else faded away as she applied the skills that had fed her family for years and would now protect the men who had become her brothers. Her finger found the trigger, and she began the slow, steady pressure that would send a precisely aimed bullet across 400 meters of Afghan mountainside. This single shot would announce to everyone, friend and enemy alike, that Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was far more than a communications specialist. But that revelation would have to wait for the perfect moment when her bullet found its target and began to turn the tide of a battle that seemed impossible to win. The rifle bucked against Maria's shoulder with familiar comfort, and she immediately worked the bolt to chamber another round while tracking the impact through her scope. 400 meters away, the Taliban sniper's head snapped backward before his body crumpled behind the rocky outcropping where he had been concealing himself. The shot had been perfect, striking exactly where she had aimed despite the challenging conditions and extreme range. Captain Morrison spun around at the sound of the unexpected shot from within their defensive perimeter, his eyes wide with confusion as he tried to identify which of his men had fired. The angle was all wrong for any of their established positions, and the precision required to engage a target at that distance exceeded what he thought possible with their current equipment and tactical situation. "Santos, what the hell was that?" he shouted over the continuing enemy fire, his voice carrying both anger and bewilderment. Maria was supposed to be monitoring radio communications, not engaging in sniper duels with enemy combatants positioned hundreds of meters away. "Enemy sniper neutralized, sir," Maria replied calmly, her eyes already searching for the second target while her hands worked automatically to adjust her scope settings. Requesting permission to continue engaging designated targets. The captain stared at her for a moment, processing information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his communications specialist. Around them, the intensity of enemy fire had noticeably decreased with the elimination of one of their primary marksmen, giving the American team their first breathing space since the ambush began. Corporal Rodriguez lowered his own rifle slightly, confused by what he had just witnessed. He had been struggling to engage targets at half the distance Maria had just successfully engaged, using equipment specifically designed for designated marksman duties. The shot he had observed was beyond what most soldiers could accomplish even under ideal range conditions, let alone during active combat in hostile terrain. Maria located her second target, another sniper positioned approximately 350 meters away behind a fallen tree that provided excellent concealment from most angles. This fighter had been systematically targeting the American team's automatic weapons, trying to eliminate their heaviest firepower and force them into a purely defensive posture. His position required a more complex shot, as only a small portion of his head and shoulder were visible through the natural camouflage. She adjusted her aim point to account for the reduced range and slightly different wind conditions at the lower elevation. Her grandfather had always emphasized that every shot was unique, requiring fresh calculations and careful observation of environmental factors. Temperature, humidity, altitude, and even the time of day could affect bullet performance in ways that separated successful hunters from those who returned home empty-handed. The second Taliban fighter was older than the first, his weathered face suggesting years of combat experience in these mountains. He moved with the confidence of someone who had survived countless engagements, carefully exposing only what was necessary to acquire and engage his targets. His rifle appeared to be a modified Soviet-era weapon, probably upgraded with modern optics, and maintained with the care that professional soldiers gave their primary tools. Through her scope, Maria could see him adjusting his position to target Sergeant Williams, who was attempting to provide covering fire for the rest of the team. The enemy sniper's movements were methodical and professional, indicating military training that exceeded the typical insurgent fighter. His elimination would significantly reduce the immediate threat to her teammates, but the shot would require perfect timing and placement. Maria controlled her breathing again, finding the natural pause between heartbeats when her body was completely still. Her rifle was zeroed for different conditions than they were currently experiencing, but years of hunting in variable weather had taught her to compensate automatically for environmental changes. The fundamentals remained the same regardless of whether her target was an elk feeding in a Montana meadow or an enemy combatant threatening American lives. The second shot rang out across the valley, and the Taliban fighter's rifle tumbled from his hands as he collapsed backward. Through her scope, Maria confirmed the hit before immediately beginning to scan for the third target. The enemy fire was becoming more sporadic as the remaining fighters realized they were being systematically eliminated by someone with exceptional long-range capabilities. Captain Morrison was no longer questioning Maria's actions, instead focusing on the tactical advantage her unexpected skills were providing. The ambush that had seemed impossible to survive was beginning to shift in their favor, but 5 enemy fighters remained in concealed positions that could still prove lethal if not addressed quickly. "Santos, can you identify the remaining positions?" he asked, his voice carrying new respect along with urgent tactical necessity. The radio crackled with updates from headquarters, indicating that extraction remained at least 30 minutes away due to the continuing security situation throughout the valley. "Affirmative, sir. I have visual on 5 additional targets," Maria responded while tracking the third sniper through her scope. This one had learned from watching his comrades fall and was being much more careful about exposure. He was positioned behind a large boulder approximately 500 meters away, using a small gap between rocks to observe the American position while remaining almost completely concealed. Her teammates were beginning to understand that their quiet communications specialist possessed capabilities that none of them had imagined. Corporal Davis stopped trying to engage distant targets with his machine gun, instead focusing on providing suppressive fire that would prevent enemy fighters from maneuvering to better positions. Sergeant Williams adjusted his position to protect Maria's flanks while she continued her methodical elimination of the enemy snipers. The third Taliban fighter was the most cautious of the group, moving only when absolutely necessary and never exposing the same body part twice in the same location. His patience and discipline suggested extensive combat experience, possibly gained fighting Soviet forces during the 1980s or other coalition troops in more recent conflicts. Eliminating him would require Maria to anticipate his movement patterns and time her shot perfectly. She studied his position for several minutes, learning his routine and identifying the moment when he would be most vulnerable. Every 30 seconds, he shifted slightly to scan different sections of the American perimeter, and during that movement, a small portion of his torso became visible for approximately 2 seconds. The window was extremely narrow, but her grandfather had taught her to hunt deer that exposed themselves for even shorter periods. Maria prepared for the most challenging shot yet, calculating the increased distance and the precise timing required to place her bullet in the exact location where the target would appear. The margin for error was essentially 0, and a miss would alert the remaining fighters to adjust their tactics accordingly. Success required the kind of patience and precision that separated professional marksmen from ordinary soldiers. The enemy sniper began his predictable movement pattern, and Maria tracked the anticipated location through her scope. Her finger found the trigger and began the steady pressure that would release the shot at exactly the right moment. Time seemed to slow as she watched through her crosshairs, waiting for the target to appear in the precise location where her bullet would arrive after traveling 500 meters through the thin mountain air. When the Taliban fighter shifted position according to his established pattern, Maria's bullet was already in flight, reaching the target location at the exact instant his torso became visible. The impact sent him spinning backward, his rifle clattering against the rocks as he fell. 3 enemy snipers were now neutralized, but remained hidden in positions that continued to threaten the American team. The psychological impact on the remaining Taliban fighters was becoming evident as their rate of fire decreased significantly. They were beginning to realize that someone was systematically hunting them with capabilities that exceeded anything they had encountered in previous engagements. The confident ambush was turning into a nightmare scenario where they were becoming the hunted rather than the hunters. Captain Morrison coordinated with his remaining team members to maintain their defensive positions, while Maria continued her deadly work. The tactical situation had completely reversed, with the enemy fighters now focused on survival rather than offensive operations. But snipers remained capable of inflicting casualties if they were allowed to reorganize or escape to fight another day. Maria located her 4th target positioned on a hillside approximately 600 meters away. This would be her longest shot yet, requiring calculations that pushed both her equipment and skills to their absolute limits. The distance meant that bullet drop would be significant, and even small errors in wind estimation could result in a complete miss. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that the most important shot was always the next one. The fourth Taliban fighter had watched his comrades fall and was now focused entirely on identifying the source of the devastating accurate fire. His position provided excellent concealment, but limited his ability to engage targets effectively. He was essentially trapped, unable to move without exposing himself to the unknown marksman who was systematically eliminating his unit. Through her scope, Maria could see him scanning the American position, trying to identify which soldier possessed the exceptional marksmanship that was destroying his carefully planned ambush. His confusion was understandable, as military doctrine suggested that such precision shooting would come from a designated marksman with specialized equipment, not from someone assigned to communications duties. This shot would require everything her grandfather had taught her about long-range shooting, combined with the confidence that came from years of successful hunts in challenging conditions. The bullet would take over a second to reach the target, during which wind, temperature, and even the Earth's rotation would affect its trajectory. Success would depend on perfect calculation and flawless execution under extreme pressure. Maria steadied her rifle against the rocky surface, using her backpack to create a stable shooting platform for the most challenging shot of her life. 600 meters across broken terrain meant she would need to compensate for significant bullet drop, while accounting for wind conditions that varied between her position and the target. Her grandfather had taught her to shoot at extreme ranges, but never under combat conditions with lives depending on her accuracy. The fourth Taliban fighter had positioned himself behind a cluster of rocks that provided excellent protection from direct fire, but limited his mobility options. Through her scope, Maria could see only a small portion of his left shoulder and the edge of his rifle barrel as he attempted to locate the source of the devastating accurate fire that had eliminated 3 of his comrades. His position suggested military training and combat experience that made him a particularly dangerous opponent. Captain Morrison crouched beside Maria, his radio crackling with updates from aerial reconnaissance. Drone footage shows the remaining 4 targets are attempting to coordinate a withdrawal, he reported quietly. If they escape, they'll set up another ambush somewhere else in the valley. We need to end this here. Maria nodded without taking her eye from a scope. Her calculations indicated the bullet would drop approximately 18 inches over the 600-meter distance, requiring her to aim significantly above her intended point of impact. Wind speed had increased slightly, pushing from left to right at an estimated 12 kilometers per hour, which would drift the bullet several inches off course without proper compensation. She had learned these calculations through countless hours practicing with her grandfather on the family ranch, where targets were often elk or deer positioned at extreme ranges across canyon systems that replicated the challenging conditions she now faced in Afghanistan. The mathematics were complex, but years of practical application had made the adjustments instinctive rather than conscious calculations. Through her crosshairs, Maria watched the enemy sniper's movement pattern, learning his rhythm and identifying the precise moment when enough of his torso would be exposed to provide a viable target. He was disciplined and careful, never exposing himself for more than a few seconds before returning to complete concealment behind the rocks that protected his position. Corporal Rodriguez observed Maria's preparations with growing amazement. The technical aspects of her shot exceeded anything taught in standard military marksmanship training, and the precision required was beyond what most soldiers could achieve even under ideal range conditions. Her calm confidence suggested experience that went far beyond basic military qualification requirements. The wind shifted slightly, and Maria made minute adjustments to her aim point. Her grandfather had always emphasized that patience was the most important skill for any marksman, teaching her to wait for perfect conditions rather than attempting marginal shots that might wound rather than eliminate the target. In hunting, a wounded animal could escape and suffer unnecessarily. In combat, a wounded enemy could continue fighting and potentially kill her teammates. Sergeant Williams maintained security on their flanks, while Maria prepared for the shot that would determine whether the ambush continued or ended in their favor. The tactical situation remained precarious, with 4 enemy fighters still capable of coordinating effective fire if given the opportunity to regroup. Time was working against them as their water and ammunition supplies continued to diminish under the intense Afghan sun. Maria controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate to minimize any tremor that might affect her aim. The target would appear in approximately 10 seconds based on his established pattern, and she needed to time her shot perfectly to place the bullet in the exact location where his torso would be exposed. The margin for error at this distance was measured in inches rather than feet. The Taliban fighter began his predictable movement, shifting position to scan a different section of the valley floor. Through her scope, Maria tracked the anticipated location where his shoulder would appear, leading the target slightly to account for his movement during the bullet's flight time. Everything depended on perfect timing and precise calculation of multiple variables that could affect bullet trajectory. Her finger found the trigger and began the smooth pressure that would release the shot at exactly the right moment. The world narrowed to just her crosshairs and the anticipated target location, with everything else fading into background awareness. This was the moment her grandfather had prepared her for through years of training in similar mountain terrain. The rifle fired with familiar recoil, and Maria immediately worked the bolt while tracking the bullet impact through her scope. The projectile traced a perfect arc across 600 meters of Afghan mountainside, arriving at the target location precisely when the enemy fighter exposed his torso to scan for American positions. The impact drove him backward, his rifle tumbling from his hands as he collapsed behind the rocks that had provided his concealment. Captain Morrison raised his binoculars to confirm the hit, his expression showing amazement at the precision shooting he had just witnessed. "Outstanding shot, Santos. How many more can you see?" "3 remaining targets, sir," Maria replied while scanning for her next target. The psychological impact on the surviving Taliban fighters was becoming evident as their fire decreased to sporadic, poorly aimed shots. They were beginning to understand that they were being systematically hunted by someone with capabilities that exceeded anything in their previous combat experience. The 5th enemy sniper had watched 4 of his comrades fall to impossibly accurate long-range fire, and was now focused entirely on escape rather than continuing the engagement. He was positioned approximately 400 meters away, using natural terrain features to mask his movement as he attempted to withdraw to a secondary position that would allow continued harassment of the American patrol. Through her scope, Maria could see him moving carefully from rock to rock, using cover and concealment techniques that demonstrated professional military training. His withdrawal was methodical and disciplined, suggesting he was either a former military officer or had received extensive training from foreign advisors. Allowing him to escape would mean facing him again under potentially worse conditions. The shot would require her to lead a moving target at extended range, calculating not just bullet drop and wind drift, but also the enemy fighter's speed and direction of movement. Her grandfather had taught her to hunt running deer under similar conditions, but never with the additional pressure of combat and the knowledge that missing might cost American lives. Maria tracked the Taliban fighter through her scope as he moved between concealed positions, studying his pattern and timing to predict his next movement. He was following military doctrine for tactical withdrawal, moving in short rushes between cover positions while maintaining observation of the American team. His discipline made him dangerous even during retreat. The terrain he was crossing included several natural choke points, where he would be forced to expose himself for longer periods. Maria identified the most likely route based on tactical principles and positioned her crosshairs at the location where he would need to cross an open area between 2 large boulders. The timing would be critical, as she would have only a few seconds to acquire, aim, and fire before he reached safety. Corporal Davis adjusted his machine gun position to provide suppressive fire that would prevent the remaining enemy fighters from supporting each other during their withdrawal attempts. The tactical situation was improving rapidly as Maria's systematic elimination of the enemy snipers removed their ability to coordinate effective fire against the American position. The 5th Taliban fighter approached the predicted crossing point, moving with the careful haste of someone who understood they were being hunted by a superior marksman. Through her scope, Maria could see his face clearly for the first time, noting the weathered features and alert eyes of a combat veteran who had survived many previous engagements through skill and experience. He paused at the edge of cover, scanning the American position before committing to the dangerous crossing that would expose him to long-range fire. His hesitation suggested he understood the risk, but his tactical situation left him no choice except to attempt the movement or remain pinned in his current position until American reinforcements arrived. Maria prepared for the shot that would eliminate the fifth threat, calculating the lead angle required to intercept a target moving at approximately 8 kilometers per hour across terrain that would affect his speed and direction. The bullet would need to arrive at the precise moment he reached the center of the open area, where he would be most vulnerable and furthest from any protective cover. Her breathing slowed automatically as she applied the techniques that had become second nature through years of practice. The rifle was an extension of her body, and the scope merely focused her vision on the task that needed to be completed. Every aspect of the shot was familiar except for the extreme consequences of success or failure in this hostile environment. The Taliban fighter committed to his movement, sprinting across the open ground between protective positions. Maria's crosshairs tracked his progress while her finger applied steady pressure to the trigger. The timing had to be perfect, with the bullet arriving exactly when the target reached the most vulnerable point of his crossing. Everything depended on the precision that her grandfather had drilled into her through countless hunting expeditions in similar terrain. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and, through the scope, she watched the fifth enemy fighter stumble and fall just meters short of the safety he had been desperately trying to reach. His rifle skittered across the rocky ground as he collapsed, eliminating another threat to the American patrol. 2 Taliban snipers remained hidden in positions that could still prove deadly if not addressed quickly and decisively. The 6th Taliban fighter had observed the systematic destruction of his unit with growing desperation and was now attempting something far more dangerous than withdrawal. Through her scope, Maria could see him maneuvering to a position that would allow him to target the American team's leadership, specifically Captain Morrison, who had been coordinating their defensive response from a partially exposed position behind their makeshift command post. This enemy sniper was different from the others, moving with the fluid precision of someone who had received advanced training beyond basic insurgent tactics. His rifle appeared to be a modern precision weapon rather than the modified Soviet equipment carried by most Taliban fighters, and his movement patterns suggested familiarity with American military doctrine that made him particularly dangerous. Captain Morrison studied his tactical map while coordinating with headquarters about extraction possibilities. The radio chattered with updates from other units throughout the valley, indicating the ambush was part of a larger coordinated attack designed to draw American forces into multiple kill zones. Their successful defense of this position was providing valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. Santos, I need you to prioritize the sniper moving toward grid reference 74 Alpha, the captain ordered, his voice carrying the tension of someone who understood they were still in mortal danger despite their recent successes. Aerial reconnaissance indicates he's carrying equipment that suggests advanced training. Maria had already identified the 6th fighter as the most immediate threat based on his position and apparent capabilities. He was approximately 500 meters away, using natural terrain features and shadows to mask his approach toward a rocky outcropping that would provide an excellent shooting position overlooking the American defensive perimeter. Eliminating him would require a shot through limited visibility and challenging environmental conditions. The morning sun was beginning to create heat shimmer that distorted long-range observation, adding another variable to calculations that were already approaching the limits of her equipment and training. Her grandfather had taught her to hunt during similar conditions in Montana, where summer heat created thermal updrafts that could deflect bullets from their intended trajectory. The key was understanding how environmental factors affected bullet flight and compensating accordingly. Through her scope, Maria studied the enemy sniper's movement pattern while calculating the complex geometry required for an intercepting shot. He was following a route that provided maximum concealment, but would eventually force him to cross several open areas where he would be vulnerable to precision fire. The challenge was predicting exactly when and where those opportunities would occur. Sergeant Williams repositioned himself to provide better security for Maria while she focused on a long-range engagement that could determine their survival. The team had developed an unspoken understanding that their communications specialist possessed capabilities that exceeded anyone's initial assessment, and they were adapting their tactics to maximize her effectiveness as their primary counter-sniper asset. The sixth Taliban fighter reached his intended position and began establishing a shooting rest using his equipment and natural terrain features. Through her scope, Maria could see him making the same careful preparations that she had learned from her grandfather, adjusting his position for maximum stability and optimal sight lines toward his intended targets. His professionalism made him extremely dangerous, but also predictable to someone who understood marksmanship fundamentals. Maria calculated the shot parameters while observing the enemy sniper's preparations. Distance was approximately 520 meters, with a slight downward angle that would reduce bullet drop compared to level ground shots. Wind was variable due to thermal currents created by the heating mountainside, requiring her to time the shot during a brief lull in air movement that occurred every few minutes. The thermal shimmer was becoming more pronounced as the sun climbed higher, creating visual distortion that made precise aiming increasingly difficult. Maria waited patiently for the atmospheric conditions to stabilize temporarily, remembering her grandfather's advice about choosing the right moment rather than forcing shots under marginal conditions. Hunting had taught her that patience usually produced better results than haste. Corporal Rodriguez watched Maria's preparation with professional interest, noting the systematic approach that separated trained marksmen from ordinary shooters. Her confidence under pressure and methodical technique suggested extensive experience that went far beyond basic military requirements. The precision of her previous shots had eliminated what seemed like an impossible tactical situation. The enemy sniper completed his position preparation and began scanning the American perimeter through his scope, searching for high-value targets that would justify the risk he had taken in maneuvering to this advanced position. His professional approach indicated he understood the tactical value of eliminating leadership elements that coordinated defensive responses. Through her crosshairs, Maria could see enough of the Taliban fighter's profile to attempt a shot, but the thermal distortion made precise aiming challenging. She waited for the brief moments when atmospheric conditions cleared, providing the visual clarity needed for accurate placement of a bullet at extended range. Her breathing slowed automatically as she prepared for the shot that would eliminate the sixth threat. The moment came when thermal currents subsided temporarily, providing clear visual definition of her target through the scope. Maria's finger found the trigger and began the steady pressure that would release the shot at exactly the right instant. The calculations were complete, environmental factors were accounted for, and her rifle was perfectly aligned with the target that threatened her teammates. The sixth shot of the engagement rang out across the valley, and through her scope, Maria confirmed another successful hit as the enemy sniper collapsed behind his carefully prepared position. His rifle tumbled from his hands, eliminating the immediate threat to Captain Morrison and the rest of the American team. One Taliban fighter remained hidden somewhere in the surrounding terrain. The psychological impact of losing 6 comrades to impossibly accurate long-range fire had completely demoralized the surviving enemy fighter. His rate of fire had decreased to occasional poorly aimed shots that posed little immediate danger, but indicated he was still alive and potentially dangerous if allowed to escape or regroup with other Taliban units in the area. Captain Morrison attempted to establish communication with the final enemy fighter using a captured radio, offering him the opportunity to surrender rather than face certain death from the unknown marksman who had systematically destroyed his entire unit. The tactical situation had completely reversed from the confident ambush that had begun several hours earlier. Maria scanned the terrain methodically, searching for any sign of the 7th and final Taliban sniper who remained hidden somewhere in the rocky landscape. Her scope revealed numerous potential hiding places among the boulders and natural terrain features that provided excellent concealment for someone skilled in camouflage and patience. Finding him would require the same systematic hunting skills her grandfather had taught her for tracking wounded game in similar mountain terrain. The radio crackled with reports from aerial reconnaissance indicating movement in several locations that could represent the final enemy fighter attempting to escape the kill zone. Heat signatures were difficult to distinguish from natural thermal sources created by the warming rocks and sparse vegetation, making visual confirmation challenging even with modern surveillance technology. Corporal Davis maintained suppressive fire towards suspected enemy positions, while conserving ammunition for the extended engagement that might be required if the final Taliban fighter chose to continue resistance rather than surrender or attempt withdrawal. The team's ammunition supplies were adequate but not unlimited, particularly for the precision shooting that had proven most effective against concealed targets. Maria located a potential position approximately 650 meters away, where the terrain provided excellent concealment and good sight lines toward the American defensive perimeter. The distance would make this her most challenging shot yet, requiring calculations that pushed her equipment and skills to absolute limits. Environmental conditions continued to deteriorate as thermal effects increased with the climbing sun. Through her scope, she detected slight movement that might indicate human presence rather than natural phenomena. The potential target was almost completely concealed behind natural terrain features, with only occasional glimpses of what might be clothing or equipment visible through gaps in the rocky landscape. Confirming the target would require patience and careful observation to distinguish between actual threats and false signatures. Her grandfather had taught her to hunt game that used similar concealment techniques, often waiting for hours until the animal made a mistake that revealed its exact location. The same principles applied to this deadly game of hide and seek, where the consequences of error meant life or death for everyone involved in the engagement. The final Taliban fighter was the most disciplined of the group, having learned from watching his comrades fall to precision fire that exceeded anything in his combat experience. His patience and professional approach made him extremely dangerous despite being outnumbered and outgunned by the American patrol and their unexpected marksman capabilities. Maria prepared for the most difficult shot of her life, calculating variables that included extreme range, deteriorating atmospheric conditions, and a target that might not even be human. Success would require perfect technique combined with the confidence that came from years of training under her grandfather's demanding standards. Missing would mean prolonging a dangerous situation that threatened everyone's survival in hostile territory, where reinforcements remained 30 minutes away. Maria held her position for nearly 20 minutes, her rifle trained on the suspected location where thermal shimmer and shadow patterns suggested human presence. Her grandfather had taught her that the most dangerous game was often the most patient, waiting for the hunter to make a mistake before revealing itself. This final Taliban fighter had observed 6 of his comrades fall to precision fire and was determined not to repeat their errors. The heat was becoming unbearable as the Afghan sun climbed toward its midday peak, and several team members were showing serious signs of dehydration. Captain Morrison made the difficult decision to rotate personnel to conserve water while maintaining tactical security, but Maria remained in position with her rifle trained on the area where she suspected the final enemy sniper was concealed. Through her scope, she studied every shadow and rock formation, looking for the subtle signs that distinguished natural terrain from human concealment. Her grandfather had taught her to hunt elk that used similar tactics, hiding in plain sight among natural features that provided perfect camouflage until movement or necessity forced them to reveal their presence. Patience was the key to success in both hunting and this deadly game of survival. Aerial reconnaissance continued providing updates about thermal signatures throughout the valley, but the increasing heat made electronic detection unreliable as warm rocks and sparse vegetation created false positives that complicated target identification. Visual confirmation remained the most reliable method for distinguishing actual threats from environmental phenomena that mimicked human heat signatures. Corporal Rodriguez observed Maria's technique with growing professional respect, noting the systematic scanning pattern and disciplined trigger control that separated trained marksmen from ordinary soldiers. Her calm patience under extreme pressure suggested experience that went far beyond basic military training, and her success rate indicated skills that most designated marksmen would envy even under ideal conditions. The radio crackled with reports from other units throughout the valley, indicating the coordinated Taliban attack was being successfully repelled by American forces who had adapted their tactics based on lessons learned from encounters like the one Maria's team was experiencing. Her successful defense was providing valuable intelligence about enemy capabilities and preferred ambush techniques. Captain Morrison studied his tactical map while coordinating with headquarters about extraction timing and route security. The immediate threat had been significantly reduced by Maria's systematic elimination of the enemy snipers, but one fighter remained capable of inflicting casualties if he chose to continue resistance rather than attempt withdrawal from his compromised position. Suddenly, Maria detected movement that was definitely human rather than environmental. The 7th Taliban fighter had grown impatient with his concealment and was attempting to reposition to a location that would provide better sight lines toward the American defensive perimeter. His movement revealed he was positioned exactly where she had suspected, approximately 650 meters away behind a cluster of rocks that had provided perfect concealment until necessity forced him to relocate. This final enemy sniper was the most experienced of the group, moving with careful precision that demonstrated advanced tactical training and combat experience gained through years of fighting coalition forces in these mountains. His equipment appeared to be modern and well-maintained, suggesting he was either a foreign advisor or a Taliban fighter who had received specialized training from external sources. Through her scope, Maria could see portions of his rifle and equipment as he prepared for movement to his new position. The distance required her most complex calculations yet, accounting for extreme bullet drop, variable wind conditions, and thermal effects that were becoming more pronounced as ground temperatures increased throughout the morning engagement. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, reminding her that the most important shot was always the one that ended the hunt successfully. Missing would mean prolonging a dangerous situation that threatened everyone's survival, while success would complete the mission that had seemed impossible when the ambush began several hours earlier. The enemy sniper began his movement across approximately 30 meters of partially concealed terrain that would bring him to a position overlooking the American patrol route. His timing was professional, using natural terrain features and calculated rushes between covered positions to minimize exposure while maintaining observation of potential threats to his movement. Maria tracked his progress through her scope, calculating the lead angle required to intercept a target moving at variable speeds across terrain that affected his movement patterns. The shot would require her to predict exactly where he would be when the bullet arrived after traveling over 600 meters through increasingly unstable atmospheric conditions. Wind conditions were variable due to thermal effects created by the heating mountainside, with air currents shifting direction and intensity every few minutes. Maria waited for the brief periods when atmospheric conditions stabilized, providing the consistent environmental factors needed for accurate long-range shooting under combat conditions. The Taliban fighter reached the midpoint of his movement, where terrain features forced him to cross an open area that exposed him to observation and potential fire from the American position. His professional approach suggested he understood the risk, but had determined the tactical advantage of reaching his new position justified the temporary vulnerability. Through her crosshairs, Maria could see his full profile as he moved across the exposed ground with the confident haste of someone who believed he was beyond effective range of standard American weapons. His mistake was underestimating the capabilities of a communications specialist who had learned to shoot at extreme ranges in terrain that replicated the challenging conditions of Afghan mountains. Maria controlled her breathing automatically, slowing her heart rate to minimize any tremor that might affect the most critical shot of the engagement. The calculation was complete, environmental factors were accounted for, and her rifle was perfectly aligned with the predicted intercept point where bullet and target would meet after carefully calculated timing and trajectory. Her finger found the trigger and applied the steady pressure that would release the 7th and final shot of an engagement that had transformed from certain death into complete tactical victory. The world narrowed to just her crosshairs and the target that represented the last threat to her teammates' survival in this hostile valley. The rifle fired with familiar recoil, and through her scope, Maria watched the bullet trace its perfect arc across 650 meters of Afghan terrain. The projectile arrived exactly when and where she had calculated, striking the final Taliban fighter just as he reached the most exposed point of his movement across the dangerous ground. The impact drove him backward, his rifle spinning from his hands as he collapsed on the rocky terrain where his movement had been stopped permanently by precision shooting that his unit had never encountered in previous engagements with American forces. 7 enemy snipers had been eliminated by a communications specialist whose true capabilities had remained hidden until circumstances demanded their revelation. Captain Morrison lowered his binoculars after confirming the final target had been neutralized, his expression showing amazement at the marksmanship display he had witnessed over the past several hours. The impossible tactical situation had been resolved through skills that exceeded anything in his combat experience, demonstrated by someone he had previously considered primarily a radio operator. "Outstanding work, Santos," he said, his voice carrying new respect along with relief that the engagement had ended successfully. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" Maria safetied her rifle and began the process of cleaning and securing her weapon according to the procedures her grandfather had drilled into her after every hunting expedition. "Montana, sir. My grandfather taught me that every shot matters, especially when other people are counting on you." The radio crackled with confirmation that extraction helicopters were inbound, having been cleared for landing now that the immediate threat had been eliminated. The coordinated Taliban attack throughout the valley had been successfully repelled, with Maria's team providing crucial intelligence about enemy tactics and capabilities that would inform future operations. Corporal Rodriguez approached Maria with professional curiosity about the techniques she had demonstrated during the engagement. "Santos, that was the best shooting I've ever seen under combat conditions. Have you considered applying for sniper school?" Maria smiled while securing her equipment for the extraction that would return them to base camp and safety. "I joined the Army to serve my country and learn technical skills, not to be a killer. But when my teammates are in danger, I'll use whatever abilities I have to bring everyone home safely." The extraction helicopters appeared over the valley rim, their rotor noise echoing off the mountains where 7 Taliban fighters had learned too late that the most dangerous predators are often the ones that hunt in silence. Maria's secret had been revealed through necessity, but her primary mission remained unchanged, ensuring her teammates survived to fight another day. As the team prepared for extraction, Captain Morrison made a mental note to review Maria's personnel file and previous training records. Her demonstrated capabilities suggested potential that had been overlooked by the military assessment system, and her humble attitude about exceptional skills indicated the kind of character that made outstanding soldiers regardless of their assigned specialty. The helicopter landing zone was secured quickly, with the team maintaining security protocols despite the elimination of immediate threats. Maria carried her radio equipment along with a rifle that had saved their lives. Looking exactly like the communications specialist she was supposed to be rather than the precision marksman who had just completed one of the most impressive shooting demonstrations in modern combat history. During the flight back to base camp, her teammates looked at Maria with new understanding about the quiet woman who had served alongside them for 8 months without revealing her extraordinary capabilities. She continued monitoring radio communications according to her assigned duties, professional and competent as always, but now they knew that Staff Sergeant Maria Santos was far more than anyone had imagined. The mission report would document 7 enemy combatants eliminated by precision fire at ranges exceeding 600 meters, achieved under combat conditions that challenged the limits of equipment and human capability. But for Maria, it was simply another day of using the skills her grandfather had taught her to protect the people who mattered most, her fellow soldiers who had become family in the harsh mountains of Afghanistan.